So can we start with you giving just a brief overview, if you had to give a brief definition of spatiotemporal neuroscience?
Yeah, good question, and thanks for inviting. And what is spatiotemporal neuroscience? Of course, at first glance, you would say, cognitive neuroscience, affective neuroscience, sensory-motor neuroscience is clear. It's a particular function. However, the function is not exactly the same as the experience of that function. So the mental state, like consciousness or sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
And these are really not covered by cognitive, affective, or sensory-motor functions. So this is one development. How and where is our experience of a particular form of cognition coming from? And that is very relevant because, for instance, you and I can have the same kind of cognition, or let's say attention or working memory, but you might experience it completely different. Clinical example, the severely depressed patient has no problems in the objective criteria of working memory, but feels, I'm horrendously bad, I cannot remember anything. So there's a dissociation between the cognitive function and the subjective experiences. That's sort of one line where I'm asking, particularly as a clinical psychiatrist, where and how do these abnormal experiences come from? Yeah, because it's purely subjective. You and I both, again, I will recruit you a lot today for the pathology. You and I can suffer from auditory verbal hallucination, but I might be diagnosed with schizophrenia and you're not, because my experience of the same hallucination is completely different. And for the audience, indeed, auditory hallucination can occur quite often in healthy, awake, normal people, without having diagnosis of schizophrenia. So that's sort of one line. That's sort of the clinical line that I'm always asking, why and how do these people, the psychotic patients, depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, have these abnormal subjective experience? That's sort of one source. The other source is that in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of discussion in the basic neuroscience. What is the resting state or the spontaneous brain activity?
Yes.
Yeah. Traditionally, cognitive neuroscience and neuroscience focus on task-evoked activity. What kind of regions, what kind of oscillations are involved in working memory, attention, executive function, and there can be quite wonderful findings, very specific. But it leaves the role open of the resting state. And then there has been studies, particularly we found that, and also others, that the resting state predicts cognitive function. So your possible performance, behavioral performance, or also the neuronal task-evoked activity may be related to the resting state. And one discovery was, for me, personally very essential. So now, of course, you ask, Georg, now you told us about the resting state and subjective experience. How on earth do you want to convert the two? So, and that was for me really the awakening from Hume and Kant. Kant said that Hume awoken him from the dogmatic slumber of thought. Same thing for me, the resting state.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. So I said, okay, if maybe the resting state is key for the sense of self.
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
Then
This
the
is about
resting
sense
state adds an intrinsic subjectivity. And that's exactly what we found. We found an overlap between default mode networked activity, resting state, and sense of self. And since then, we have various studies where the resting state really predicts our sense of self. So suddenly for me, and now going back now to the clinical work, maybe the resting state is the source of the subjectivity of our experiences.
Gotcha.
Last thing, then I said, okay, which features in the resting state are key for the mental features and the subjectivity? That's the spatial and temporal features.
And so why spatiotemporal? Because presumably these questions could have been explored with third-party functional neuroscience. So why spatiotemporal? Why did your exploration of resting state consciousness and exploring the self, how did it lead you to that paradigm, that perspective?
Yeah, very good, very, very good question. So usually in cognitive neuroscience, time and space are only considered in perception and cognition. So how do I perceive the outer time? Yeah, How long does this Zoom interview already last? What is my perception of that? However, our brain and our mind, that goes back to Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, has also an inner time. So the brain has its own inner clock. So imagine you have two clocks, one clock in the brain and one clock in the environment. So suddenly the brain and the inner clock does not always go with the outer time. Yeah.
That's right.
Somehow they differ a little bit. That's the subjectivity, that difference. And that led me to say maybe the brain has its own inner time. Yeah. Sometimes a little bit faster and sometimes a little bit slower. Example, depression. In depression, you have the feeling that everything is too slow. Your inner time is literally too slow, and the brain is literally too slow. We measured all of that. But the outer time relative to that, of course, experience way too fast. So here you see some discrepancy. And then spatial is a little bit more difficult, but it's basically your overall relative relation of the regions in network among each other / topography. But we can probably discuss it later. So that led me to space and time is the intrinsic features that define the spontaneous brain activity as spontaneous brain activity. And those impact then the task-evoked activity and the cognition and emotion and so on.
Yeah, you have this fascinating comment or conceptualization of the self in terms of time being, the cadence with which self-reflective self-reflective thought comes to consciousness. The cadence there is a space or is a temporal way of conceptualizing the self, which was new to me. Could you expand a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, start just with the phenomenology. So we change continuously, our body continuously. Just tomorrow you shave your beard, but you will say, I'm still Thomas Moore. Yeah, this is objectively, sorry to say, completely crazy. Yeah, you look completely different. You have like the Afro look. Yeah, you completely look, nobody would recognize you, but you yourself still have the sense, I'm the same guy. Yeah. So for me, one of the most fascinating features is that you continuously change, your body change, your outer environment, your thoughts, everything changes, but you still have this sense of self that you remain the same person. Yeah. So for me, the self is inherently temporal. This probably goes more with Eastern cultures. There's a sense of flow, of time, has a much stronger standing than in the Western, particularly the Anglo-American world, where time is usually chopped up into entities.
That's right. And we always, one of the arguments of folks that I've followed a lot in the meditative space and Buddhist contemplative space is this deconstruction of the self and consciousness. It's not there, it's not a thing sitting in your head, which certainly comes from Western philosophy and Judeo-Christian philosophy. But the idea that, the self can still be conceived in this time-based way, even that sort of correlates and still works within these perspectives of deconstructing the self and these paradigms of contemplative perspective of the self. Because every time you're reminded of yourself, it's brought back to consciousness from the time-based perspective. There it is. That's yourself.
Yeah. I mean, this has a long history. The Western, the entity, the self as entity, has a long history in Western philosophy. And for me, it's the self is, if the self weren't changing, you become depressed or ultimately you die, at least mentally. Yeah. So, and then of course the question then, if there's continuous change, how can we have the experience of sameness? And that's where I would argue is the kind of pattern of change. The content continuously change, but the waves, the constellation, let's say, of faster and slower waves remains the same. And that is your sense of self. And that's exactly what we found in the empirical data. Literally. Yeah, that's the waves of your spontaneous activity, the constellation of the slow and fast waves. For the experts, the power spectrum, slow, fast dynamics, and scale-free dynamics, and the time scales, durations, they are specific for each individual, and they relate to their sense of self.
And are they specific for the disorders too, in terms of the dynamics there of space and time?
Correct. In depression, it's literally too slow. And we found that. And in mania, it's literally too fast. And what happens in mania? Your inner time is too fast. You move constantly. Let's say if I were manic, I wouldn't sit still in this chair anymore. So I don't dare to move so that I don't get the diagnosis.
and then how is this measured? When you're measuring something from this perspective, you talk about temporal dynamics, the long-range temporal dynamics, and how these relate to each other. How is that measured, and how is that different than per se, functional neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, and the like?
Yeah, good question. So first, how can you measure? I mean, if you're too fast, your speed. You can measure your speed. Yeah, okay. You can measure the change of neuronal activity over time. That you can measure, for instance, with neuronal, what is called neuronal variability, how much the amplitude changes over time. And if there's a lot of changes, you have the feeling things happen fast. If I move my hands like this or like this, it's clear. Yeah. So here I have a lot of change, so I'm fast. Yeah, and I can also speak much slower, or I can speak very, very fast. Yeah, so same thing in the brain. You can literally measure that. There are different measures like neuronal variabilities, and you can also measure how the ongoing phase fluctuations, the wave change with frequency sliding for the expert. So the various measures, particularly from engineering, if you ask the engineers, they can tell you a lot about these basic measures of speed, velocity. And you can really measure that in the brain. You can also do this spatially, how fast it goes from one region to another. And then you can also measure it on the mental level, how much your thought changes. Yeah, we have even one study where we ask subject also click the button when your thought changes. Same thing. And in depression, again, the thought didn't change. Yeah, it was much slower. Yeah, so literally you can measure that. So it's a different view. And you were asking also, how does that relate to cognitive neuroscience? So let me give you a prototypical example, thought. Yeah, thought. So you can investigate whether you have more internally oriented thoughts about your own self or externally oriented self about the environment. So, and then you can say, okay, cognitive approach would now ask what kind of thoughts about yourself you have. Yeah, your internal thoughts. Are your thoughts about guilt, hopelessness, you're not worth it, you cannot pay the money for the hospital stay? That would be a typical cognitive analysis of thoughts, of internal or external oriented thoughts, let's say in depression. What we did know, we weren't interested in the content, but we say, how often do internal and external thoughts change? And how long do the internal thoughts stay?
Very cool.
And what we observed is in the depressed patients, the internally oriented thoughts stayed much longer. So, of course, you ruminate about your own sense of self, and that is associated with negative emotion skills.
Yeah.
That's the difference between a dynamic and a cognitive analysis. They're not exclusive, they're combined, and that's what we try.
Yeah. But it's fascinating because it really does, it forces you to think from a different, or at least for me, forces me to think about time. What am I not measuring? What am I not controlling for when it comes to time in the way that I'm conceiving this? Now, you also mentioned in your book, Neurophilosophy, schizophrenia being a mismatch in the inner sense of time and the outer sense of time. And so can you talk a little bit about this when it comes to, and also when it comes to the mind, what you call the mind world problem, as opposed to the mind, like mind body problem, the mind world problem you speak? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Once. Yeah.
Two big questions at once.
Schizophrenia and mind world.
Okay. Forgive me. Let's start with schizophrenia, and then we'll move to this mind world perspective. So let's start with the mismatch between internal timescales and external timescales in schizophrenia.
Yeah. So in schizophrenia, since of course 2016, I wrote that. So we refined this in the meantime. So what happens? So for me, mental disorders are spatial-temporal disorders. Yeah, we could also talk about space later. In this case, temporal. So depression, you already said, is speed disorder. And I just read my first paper. I dared to publish that depression is not just a mood disorder. It's a speed disorder. So now, what is depression? So I'm saying, what is schizophrenia? So what I need to do is that different features and dimensions of time may be disturbed in slightly different ways in the different disorders. Depression, speed. Anxiety, what is anxiety? Prediction and uncertainty, irregularity, temporal irregularity, and your brain is too fast. Yeah. Just yesterday, I had a patient of mine. She said, when I get anxious, it feels like on a roller coaster and the damn thing stops on the top and you can't go down and you don't know whether you can go. Yeah.
Okay.
Uncertainty, temporal irregularity, and you cannot predict. So that's about temporal irregularity prediction. What is schizophrenia? So schizophrenia for me, and this is based on various brain findings, also subjective findings, that they suffer from temporal imprecision. So I give you an example how important temporal precision is. So I'm in charge of our breakfast at home on the weekends. And suddenly I heard 3 beeps at the same time. It was the pot on the stove for the egg, it was the water boiler, and it was the microwave. They all beeped at the same time. And I was completely confused.
Mm.
Yeah, it was not my imagination. This was real.
Yeah. Real occurrence.
And I was completely confused because usually you would expect they separate. So now in schizophrenia, the opposite happens. Things which usually go together, they separate. They're imprecise. Now, imagine when you listen to music, you dance with the rhythm of the music. Yeah, and you beat and you tap the beat and you feel really great the better you tap the beat or dance. Schizophrenia cannot synchronize with these kind of things. They're always either off, too late, too early, and it's completely irrelevant. Why? Because their ongoing waves in the brain are imprecise in the middle. They do something like this. So imagine my wave is always going like this. I just discussed it with one of my students this morning. It's always a little unsharp. And it's in the millisecond range, 8 to 10 milliseconds. It's amazing. And that makes our answer. So suddenly you put together things which belong to the external world, you do this, suddenly they go together with the internal thoughts. And of course.
And you end up with a delusion of sorts.
I have the feeling you want to kill me. That's the delusion.
Yes.
And so it's really what we call a phase-based temporal imprecision, so wave-based temporal imprecision model, and we have more and more devices, and we also want to use it as a diagnostic marker, specific for schizophrenia. And how do subjects experience these little things? They experience that their thoughts are temporally fragmented, also their perception. So things don't go together. Yeah, suddenly it's desynchronized, and that's a quite well-known finding. So here now, we're conducting now studies how we directly link this temporal imprecision of your ongoing wave cycles with the experience of temporal fragmentation.
Yeah. Okay. So now when it comes to time in the brain, and I was going to save clinical stuff for the end, but let's jump into it now because I'm thinking about it, is, from the perspective of a practicing clinician, you're interested, well, depending on your theoretical orientation, a lot of times the interest is in whatever the version of wellness is, the goal for wellness, which is mutually determined between client and therapist. And there's a lot of theory involved here, but the idea is that we're trying to make some change, particularly in depression, bipolar. If we're talking about a very slow and very fast way, how are we creating change so that there's some sort of homeostasis or there's some sort of adjustment in the temporal synchronization between an individual and the world in their subjective experience so that wellness results?
Yeah, very good question. So I tell you what we're doing in that direction. We're developing personalized, precision-based breathing therapy, music therapy, and meditation. I'll tell you what it is. So what is fast for you may be slow for me, meaning you and I have a different base now. And you all know that breathing has a long tradition in the Indian tradition, you know that, and breathing for anxiety. Now, when you look into the online net slow breathing protocol are 6 breaths per minute. So we said, no, breathing is different for each subject. We want to test what is the optimal breathing rate for subjects who suffer from anxiety. So and we tested different breathing rates from 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 breaths per minute. And we have an EEG and we have psychological questionnaires with both. And based on these combined neuronal and psychological, let's say, breathing speed analysis, we say this is the optimal breathing rate. And from our 100 subjects so far, only 10%, literally 10 subjects, prefer 6, the standard slow breathing rate. 90% have another breathing rate as preferred optimal breathing rate, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9. So you can really personalize. And then they get an app with this personalized breathing rate, 10 minutes breathing in the morning, 10 minutes breathing in the evening. And we again compare before and after the breathing, the 10 minutes, and see huge reduction in anxiety, 25 to 40%. Immediate effect after 10 minutes with the personalized breathing rate. So what do I emphasize here? Look, Northoff, your spatio-temporal neuroscience all sounds good as abstract, but here it's put to practice. Yeah? Because everybody, and we all know this, has her or his own natural speed. You're a little faster than me, I'm slower, the other one, and so on and so forth. So the personalization is extremely important. So we have very good therapeutic results, in particular the immediate effect. So I tell you, example of one of my clients, brilliant engineer, academic and also industry, but she can't give public talks. So you can imagine it's a disaster for somebody in industry as well as in academia.
Yeah.
So social anxiety. Yeah. So what we did, we tailored her optimal breathing rate. Optimal breathing rate was 4, not 6. And now before talks, when she has to give public talks, she go briefly to the restroom, does a 2-3 minutes breathing, and then go out.
Wow.
We can really show immediate effect. So here you see spatio-temporal neuroscience put into practice. Yeah?
Yeah.
We do similar thing for music therapy, speed of music therapy, so that patients come severely depressed, and we modify the speed of the music piece, and then again determine which is the optimal speed for you. And one of the most amazing things, when we started this 1 year ago, we were absolutely amazed. So they bring their preferred pieces, yeah, which they know in and out.
Yeah.
And in our investigations, EEG and psychology, it comes out that they like another speed better than the original, even though they know this.
Wow. Wow.
Same goes for healthy subjects. They also like, so that's where your brain plays a trick.
Yeah.
That's subjectivity of your brain. That's your spontaneous, your intrinsic natural features.
And so what happens to the depressed patients after they listen to their favorite piece of music at optimal speed?
They don't like it as much. Yeah, in the personally preferred speed, it has a good effect. Again, the 10 minutes effect before, after are again 30 to 40%.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's because here we give a tool for immediate therapeutic effects. Yeah. You don't need to take benzodiazepines or you're doing something else. You can rely on it. It's repeated. In 90% of all morning sessions, you see this effect.
Wow. And so the hope is then, is the hope then that the brain sort of will long term, can it change its temporal dynamic? Can depression then, if from that perspective that's moving too slow, will it speed up? Will it, over time, does it become more aligned?
Very good question. That's exactly what we observe after 3 and 6 weeks. In the anxiety patients, the preferred breathing rate became slower. And that's what you want. When you see in acute, you know this, acute anxiety, but like this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now the slow down and become regular, and that calms down your thoughts, your racing thoughts. And that's exactly, so the preferred breathing rate becomes slower. You can see this in the statistics index.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. So let's pivot a little bit to neuropsychoanalysis, because the book that I most recently read of yours on neuropsychoanalysis from the Routledge collection, you give a little bit of overview of the field itself, but what's the importance? Well, let's start with this. How does the spatio-temporal neuropsychoanalysis compare and contrast with like traditional Solmesian neuropsychoanalysis?
Yeah. I tell you how I got into psychoanalysis, and that already gives you a hint. So when I was a resident in psychiatry, one of my colleagues, he was in a neighboring hospital and program, and they had particular psychodynamic psychiatry. So and what attracted me is that psychodynamics really takes seriously the subject, the subjectivity. Yeah. Because as you know, otherwise neuroscience and psychiatry claims to be objective, but that is right, but you can't confuse that with the intrinsic subjectivity itself. So that's what attracted me to psychoanalysis. And then, of course, because I'm a brain guy, I want to link this to the brain stuff. So, and then when you go back to Freud himself, the 1895 is a famous writing, Scientific Psychology, which he never published in his lifetime. And when you read that, I was really fascinated because he really tries a dynamic view of the brain and mind. Yeah, he tried to link brain and mind, and that was the last time he tried to do this, and then he gave up and just shifted to the mind.
Yeah.
But when you read that, but he brings some turbulence and hydro stuff, because of course it was the beginning of the 20th century, so they didn't know all this kind of stuff. But he really tries to make the link, and then became clear. Come on, what for him is psychodynamics? Psychodynamics. What is dynamics? The pattern of change over time. Now, fortunately, 100 years later, we have the tools from physics to investigate these patterns themselves. Let's say, as I said, speed, precision, irregularity, and so on and so forth. So it's really a psychodynamic, these dynamic processes, yeah? And that's where I see the psychodynamic can be linked to the neurodynamics. And I find concepts like defense mechanism, how in psychoanalysis or cathexis energy, I find them very helpful to explain clinical phenomena.
Okay.
Yeah? Because they describe subjective psychological processes, which you don't find in the traditional psychology.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm learning as I move into the psychodynamic space, is that this is a very robust way of talking about the psychic landscape and the way it moves, and some of these expressions that you hear in common parlance, like ego and defense mechanism, is part of obviously a bigger epistemology when it comes to how the mind works. But because of the sort of the detail, and also, as you mentioned, the ability for it to see the mind as changing rather than static, makes it well suited not only to clinical, but as you're saying too, you're able to map that to what you're seeing spatiotemporally in the neuroscience. And you have a really interesting comment about defense mechanism and alpha power as a gate mechanism, like a gate to. Could you go into that, because that to me was such a new conceptualization of defense mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, what is defense mechanism? It's not input processing. Yeah, you have inputs, and the traditional view is, and that's really important. Traditional cognitive neuroscience says the input, let's say here, like here, the mark is represented in your visual cortex, in your brain regions.
Okay.
No, that's not what the brain does. And then, okay, you have this representation, let's say here in my occipital cortex, my visual cortex, and then some subsequent processing, cognitive processing, emotional processing, add something to it. But I think the change starts earlier. It already starts. We don't process just this input by itself. We process these as different inputs relative to the context. Meaning, if I were showing you this against a completely different context, you would perceive this also different. So what your brain processes and encodes is certain stochastic distributions, random probability distribution of your input, and then it constructs a mug out of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So now, what is then defense mechanism? So, and I think that's a key part. And of course, I would argue, and we have a lot of empirical support for that, that this input processing is strongly determined by spatial and temporal features of the brain itself. So I see a very fast mug here. Let's say, I know it's not a good example, but doesn't matter, but my visual brain regions are too slow. So I will not perceive it like this. I will perceive it like this.
Okay.
So my brain radically changes it. And we can see this again my beloved example, depression, where we literally showed that. Yeah. So that's why, so you see, and then you might, if it's so slow, you might not even perceive it as a mug anymore, or if it's too fast. Yeah. So, and I think that's key. And how your brain reacts to that for me is a defense mechanism. Yeah. And alpha power is the key. So alpha, it's in the EEG when you measure the electrical brain waves, and you have usually more power in the slower wave, less power in the faster waves. That's like when you go to the seaside from Baltimore, it's not far. You go to the seaside, you see the big waves, very powerful, and you see the small waves, less powerful. But the alpha is special. It's sort of a trick. It sort of has relatively high power. It's sort of a peak in what you call the power spectrum. So it's a special wave. To be honest, nobody really knows what it is good for. That's still after 100 years. We have it was 1929.
We're working on that
one. by a German described, and we still don't really know. Hans Berger, who invented the EEG, and he observed it. But one thing is clear: it's relevant for input process. So your wave, when you're in the resting state, when your eyes are closed, the alpha wave is very high. But now, that's basically the door is closed. Yeah, I don't want to let anybody in. No visitors today. So now, when you open your eyes or you process specific things with the open eyes, your alpha reduces, meaning the door is open. Yeah. And of course, the door can be open to different degrees. Maybe it's only open a little bit, so 1 or 2 people can go through, or it's open all the way, all the 50 people can go through. Yeah. That's the input processing of the brain.
So if it's opened all the way, that's the idea that there's no sort of defense or sort of maybe pathological defense mechanism in place that's stopping that from.
Exactly. That's your titrating of the defense. And of course, for the brain as an organ, biologically considered, you need to be in touch with the environment because you want to be adaptive and stay alive, but also you need to preserve yourself. So you need to open the gate to a certain extent, but not fully. Yeah, as you said, nice, Matthew, completely overswarmed. And that's part of the defense mechanism. Exactly. Yeah, it's a key. So alpha is really key. Absolutely.
Wow. And so another question I had is a concept that comes up a lot in your writing of nesting. So temporal spatial dynamics nesting within the larger one. And so particularly in like attachment in childhood development, and we think of the brain developing, the importance of the child's brain being nested within, or the dynamic of the spatiotemporal dynamic of the child's brain being nested somehow in that of the mother and the larger ecology. So how does that work?
Yeah, you see, I'm fascinated by the brain and mind. And this is one of the key aspects. So again, remember we said earlier, when you dance to music, you follow the rhythm. And you can see that your wave, the rhythm of your waves in the brain, your intertrial phase coherence, you measure that for the experts, the wave of your brain follow in their rhythm, in their timing, exactly the timing of them. Yeah. And that's why early infant interactions are very important. The little baby follows the rhythm of the music. Yeah. Even in pregnancy, when the mother plays a lot of Bach, the little one is already used to it. And when it comes out, and then you play the Bach again, and then it's calmed down because it knows the rhythm, meaning you can attune, you can align, you can synchronize, and that makes you feel good. So, and how is that possible? The same with, you had it earlier, the meditation, the flow experience. You're in a flow, or I'm a runner. I run every day like crazy, or now in Canada, I do ice skating.
In the snow.
No, we have a long canal, 8 kilometers, where you can ice skating. It's very nice.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, and you get into flow. So how is that possible? You become aware, you're part, let's say, pianist. My partner is a composer and pianist. So you become part of the piano and part of the music. So you're completely nested, like the Russian doll, a smaller one nesting within a larger one. Yeah. So in the brain is exactly the same. When you're this alignment, we call it temporal spatial alignment or attunement. This is absolutely key. Yeah. And for instance, when you're in deep meditation, you align much better with your outer environmental context. You're not as internally focused anymore. You don't even make the difference between internal and external elements. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And
that's the idea of flow too. And we were talking earlier on a previous call, because I had the privilege of meeting your research team that's doing the psychotherapy studies over in Italy, of intra-subjective resonance. So if you could explain that, the three parts of the self and how they can be resonant, and then we can move to resonance across the therapeutic dyad. So first of all, in the self.
Yeah, no, I mean, I start with the other way. If you allow me, I start with the other way.
Yeah, of course.
You're in a psychotherapy session. Yeah, can even be Zoom. Yeah, and certain sessions, oh God, 1 hour, and you get tired as a therapist, and the client probably too, and shit therapist, I don't want to work with him anymore. And suddenly, after 45 minutes, you wake up as a therapist. Of course, you don't sleep, but you still follow.
Yeah.
But why? Because the client might have said something which is really relevant for her or for himself, and you sense that. Because 90% of the psychotherapeutic process is unconscious. Yeah, you just sense it. It's nonverbal. That's important. Yeah. So, and suddenly you can synchronize, and suddenly you say, yeah, and then you interpret it. And the client said, yes, exactly that. I didn't know this. That really makes sense too. Session saved. It's incredible. Even I do this for so many years now, and I still experience. Yeah, well,
yeah,
and suddenly, yeah, and that's synchronization. Why? Because there's a certain wave in the client, let's say, which resonates with your wave / synchronizes. Yeah. And psychotherapy, and there have been many studies which show that it is not the technique which predicts the therapeutic effect, it's the relationship. Now, of course, Northoff asks then, what is the relationship? Temporal and spatial coordination. How close do I sit? If I'm close to sit, if I have a very aggressive patient, where I have to sense, my God, this person is really aggressive, I keep my distance. Yeah, and that's probably very important for the client himself. Yeah, because she or he is probably afraid of having too close distance.
Which is why they're aggressive. Yeah,
and that's why they're aggressive. Yeah, so you need to give them literally space. Yeah, another thing which I often observe, even in non-psychotherapeutic session, somebody sits like this, within a millisecond, you have the same posture. Yeah.
Oof, yes. Yeah.
It's unbelievable. It's alone. And there's no control. That's your dynamic underpinning, and you probably know this. I always show these iceberg pictures. That's the layers, the iceberg, the dynamics. It's like a cooking pot. The meal is cooking and bouncing back and forth, and nothing is visible yet. That's where it is.
Wow. And so how important is the therapist's intrasubjective harmony? And the reason I bring this up is because I reflected against a lot of my training in like Rogerian counseling, which is always this, it's having empathy, of course, for your client, but there's also the necessity for authenticity, which is the alignment of the counselor's experience of what they're sensing from the client, what they're sensing within themselves, and being able to get out of the way of that when like, for example, not using their own defense mechanisms, to allow a certain amount of congruence. And I wonder how that relates to intrasubjective resonance, whether you think there's a connection there.
Definitely. So for me, when you were saying that, I'm just now work just via association, just spontaneous what came to my mind. You just have to have a basic interest and concern in the other, and the other feels that. Yeah, even if you have 45 minutes where you have no idea what's going on and you're just tired. But people feel that because we have a deeper layer, nonverbal, where we feel this. Yeah, we have sensors for that. Unconscious. Some people speak of the sixth sense. Yeah. And that's exactly what you mean. Yeah. So, of course, you can train it, but you have a certain capacity. Yeah. You have a certain capacity, let's say, for empathy. And that, of course, in part also depends upon your own life history. So with my collaborator, who's a former postdoc student, who's now professor in Bergamo, Andrea Scalabrini in Italy, we wrote a paper together where we really said, look, let's say if I have a very limited repertoire of timescales, only shorter because I'm an anxious person, introspective concerns, instability, maybe because of my nervous mother or my life history, yeah? So, and I really need let's say, the Northoff breathing protocol to calm down, yeah?
Yeah.
And of course, only that one. And yeah, and I need it. Then I have probably problems with longer, slower timescales, yeah? So now if I have a client who has major traumatic concerns and she or he, the client, will need longer timescales from the therapist to integrate her or his shorter timescale into traumatic event. Yeah, so it's a virtual transfer of timescales. I know this probably sounds crazy, but it's literally.
No, this is what I'm getting at. This is what the transfer of timescales.
Yeah, transfer of timescales. So let's say, and you can see that. So the client's reports about the trauma, the traumatic event, yeah, or indirectly, of course, yeah, some substitute.
Yes.
So now I, as a therapist, sense, but I speak very calm, yeah. So with my calmness, I introduce a longer time scale. Then I say, I could imagine that this, what you feel now, the emotions, could be related to that and that kind of event. And I would say this in a slow voice because you just do this intuitively. Yeah.
Yes.
As a good therapist,
yeah.
You do this intuitively because you're tuned. And also, if you say it slow, it has more gravitas. Yeah. So it's more powerful, literally. Yeah. Physicists tell you, you're more powerful. So it has a more powerful effect on your client. And then the client recognizes her and says, yes, that's true. And in that moment, the client feels the relief.
Wow. Yeah.
Because it's no longer tied with these past time scales. They can be integrated into the longer wave which you as therapist provide.
Yeah. And that's why I think it's so important to have even if, a lot of this is heavy, the brain and is heavy for a lot of us. I know it is for me, but I think it's really important for therapists to have that perspective. It's just another tool in the belt in terms of knowing how time impacts subjective experience. Really changes the way we work, like just as in the example that you gave. And let me ask you this in terms of what's coming down the pipeline for spatiotemporal neuroscience and also spatiotemporal psychotherapy. What's the future? What are we going to see in the future with this?
I cannot predict the future, but
oh, come on.
The direction I'm going. So trust me, when I started with all of this spatiotemporal approach, you can't imagine the kind of reactions I got. They were not very positive. They said it's trivial, time and space. So it's, academics need some time to get used to something new, like every academics are different. So, but it's getting better and better because we really make this link and we really speak that time and space is shared by the neuronal and mental. We speak of a common current. Yeah. So, and this is really our research program. So we have a lot of studies now. We have a line of fascinating that we use different kinds of thoughts, different kinds of timescales. So your shorter and longer timescales shape the kind of thoughts you have. Yeah.
Incredible.
So particularly as a philosopher, for me, this is completely crazy because as a philosopher, you work with thought. Yeah. And again, the clinical applications, see at your clients, your patients, they have often thought changes, anxiety, racing thoughts. They all tell us before you have the anxiety attacks, you have racing thoughts. Yeah, so the time scale is too fast. So that's definitely where we really try to link, basically make the proof of principle that really it's spatial and temporal features of your brain body environment shape your cognition, your sense of self, your consciousness. We developed a temporal spatial theory of consciousness. And these things, I can see this now, it gains also, which is very nice for me to see, gains more and more traction among others, particularly among young people, which is really nice. So that's on the neuroscience side. So if you develop different kinds of mental features, thought, emotions, consciousness, sense of self, a spatio-temporal shape. So that's basically the basic neuroscience. Then the spatio-temporal psychiatry and spatio-temporal psychotherapy is that I say, look, different mental disorders like anxiety, like depression, like schizophrenia, like bipolar, like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, have slightly underlying spatio-temporal disturbances. I gave you the example. For me, depression is not just a mood disorder, it's a speed disorder. Yeah. And if you know the basic disturbance, then you can develop differential diagnostic markers. And that's what I'm trying to do. What I would love to do, so I have a lot of proof of principle studies that, and psychosis, schizophrenia is temporal imprecision. I mentioned that already earlier. So they can different neuronal markers and also psychological. And I hope that these markers can serve for differential diagnosis. And as you may know, in the field of psychiatry, we have no biomarkers. We have no diagnostic markers. You come to the doctor. In cardiology, they investigate your heart for 2 days. Then you get a diagnosis. And then you get a therapy. In psychiatry, you come to the psychologist or the doctor or the counselor. Okay, listen, okay, you get depression and you get a drug.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you
hear me. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
So, and that's why I said differential diagnostic markers. And then if it's a speed disorder, then I know, okay, what is your individual level of speed? How do I need to change that? The personalized therapies.
Yeah.
And that's
very
what
cool.
we develop. We also want to develop, we also use computational model together with brain imaging, also to personalize pharmacotherapy and stimulation therapy, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, in a direction similar what I mentioned with the breathing into music therapy. And we also want to personalize the meditation. What is the best form of meditation? Actually, it was very interesting. We have a study in Italy going on where we have the same subjects exposed to 4 different forms of meditation, more structured like breathwatch or vipassana, where you scan your different body parts, or very open like shunya, where you just let your thoughts float by. And these are expert meditation. And it was actually a nun from a Zen nun.
Oh, cool.
And she underwent these 4 forms of meditation. Experienced nun, long-term Zen. I mean, Zen Buddhism is something, yeah?
Oh, yeah.
And she said, the breathwatch, I didn't like it at all because in former times when I had anxiety attacks, they gave me breathwatch and it made my anxiety worse. 20 years later, that was still there. Now she was an experienced meditator. So that tells you how important it is to personalize.
Personalize it.
Inner to the individual subject. And
tying into as you mentioned, biomarkers, that this is big for me. I write a lot about it because it cuts out the some of the gray area of the language of disorder, the language of psychopathology, which is less specific and, as you say, less tailored. So to be able to measure things in real time with clients and then adjust therapies, I mean, to me that's the future. That's the future of psychotherapy. Yeah. So that's what we're trying. So, and for psychotherapy too, we measure the synchronization. Yeah. We also want to assess the psychotherapist, her or himself, to see which psychotherapist is ideally suited for what client. Oh, very cool. Yeah. So that we really have the matching, and we developed actually in Florence, in Italy, Lorenzo, whom you met, Zoom call, he develops that. So you see, that's what we try to develop. So we really I try to do academically proof of principle studies, and ideally, I would like to do also large-scale clinical studies, which say 500 or 1,000 more subjects, because that's what you need to validate things. Yeah, and the problem of financing. How do you get the money? That's right. Work to do. Well, It's been great I really appreciate you going over some of these concepts, having the opportunity to interview you. Big fan of your work, and great to have you on the show. I know my listeners will enjoy hearing about all of this. And, thank you. I hope we can chat again. I hope we can work again. Anything you want kind of to say for the show or yeah, so thank you first also that you picked up our work. I really appreciate. And I also, so for me, it's always
an honor, I must say, if a person who does practical work, real work, meaning psychotherapy, counseling with clients, and that they can find some meaning in our work. That means for me, it works. It has a meaning. It's relevant. And that validates it. That validates it much better when an academic colleague says, your work is great, and then the next day you get a paper for review. So, you see what I mean? So because that's real. Or when the patients say, I often, now with my clients, I often tell them, how does this come about? And then I tell them the spatio-temporal, and they say, that really makes sense. It really helps. That's the biggest compliment one can get as a scientist, and as a clinician too. So I'm very happy about that. And that ultimately, I mean, let's say, even if people say, come on, the way you build the engine into the car doesn't work. But if the car drives very well and fast, it works. So you can argue whatever you want, the damn thing works. What I hope to do with the spatio-temporal psychiatry and also the spatio-temporal psychotherapy, if it really helps, there must be some truth to it.
Yeah, that's great. And it is helping, and it's exciting. And, I think your work's going to make a lot of change. So thank you so much. And thanks for coming on the show. Let's be in touch.
Yeah, thank you. Let's keep in touch, dialogue with the psychotherapy. Yeah, thanks so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll be in touch. Maybe we can do that other show we talked about if the team is down.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Bye.
Have a good one. Bye.